Kepler 442b had earned its reputation the hard way, by devouring 3 previous survey expeditions with the casual efficiency of a cosmic wood chipper. The Galactic Mining Consortium's bureaucrats, in their infinite wisdom, had classified it as extinction-level hostile and slapped a hazard pay multiplier on any fool brave enough to set foot on its crystalline surface, which naturally meant humans volunteered in droves. The planet's surface gleamed like broken glass under its binary suns, a testament to the peculiar evolutionary arms race that had produced creatures capable of growing diamond-hard carapaces and claws that could slice through titanium alloy. The local ecosystem had apparently decided that subtlety was for weaklings, and had instead embraced the philosophy that everything should be capable of killing everything else in increasingly creative ways. Standing at the edge of the mineral survey camp, the human geologist adjusted her atmospheric processor and surveyed the glittering wasteland with the sort of professional detachment that came from a species that had evolved on a planet where literally everything was trying to kill them. Her 3 alien teammates, a nervous Zephyrin, a perpetually anxious Keth, and a Vrex who seemed to vibrate with barely contained terror, huddled around their equipment like prey animals at a watering hole. "Remind me why we couldn't just use orbital scanners for this," chittered the Zephyrin, his translucent skin flickering through various shades of distress. His name was something unpronounceable that roughly translated to cautious contemplation of distant minerals, which the human had shortened to cautious for the sake of everyone's sanity. "Because," the human replied with the patience of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow child, "orbital scanners can't detect the quantum signature variations in the crystalline matrix that indicate high-yield deposits. We need boots on the ground, samples in hand," and a howl echoed across the crystal plains, a sound that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and go straight to the primal terror centers of the brain. The 3 aliens immediately began the complex dance of beings who desperately wanted to be anywhere else, but were too terrified to move. "Oh, wonderful," the human muttered, checking her seismic detector. The welcoming committee's early today. The Keth, whose species had evolved from prey animals and never quite gotten over it, began hyperventilating in a pattern that sounded like a broken air recycler. "That's them, isn't it? The crystalline stalkers. The ones that hunt in packs and can track prey across continents by scent alone. They're called apex predators for a reason," the Vex added helpfully, his 4 arms already reaching for the emergency beacon. The last survey team lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes before another howl, closer this time, cut through his explanation like a plasma cutter through tissue paper. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, an acoustic trick that the planet's predators had evolved to disorient their prey before moving in for the kill. The human checked her equipment methodically: scanner, sample containers, emergency shelter, and the reassuring weight of her survey tools. It wasn't much, but her species had conquered their homeworld with less. The atmospheric processor hummed quietly, a mechanical counterpoint to the rising panic of her teammates. "Look," she said, injecting a note of calm authority into her voice. "We've got 4 hours of daylight left. That's plenty of time to collect the samples we need and get back to the ship before..." The scanner in her hands suddenly erupted in a cascade of warnings: seismic activity, heat signatures, and a proximity alert that painted the surrounding area in urgent red. The crystalline stalkers weren't just hunting. They were coordinating, moving in formation with a kind of tactical precision that suggested intelligence far beyond simple predatory instinct. "They're surrounding us," Cautious whispered, his skin now a sickly shade of transparent terror. "Standard pack hunting formation. They'll drive us toward the thermal vents, where the ground is unstable, and then..." The Vrex was already activating the emergency beacon, his 4 hands working with desperate efficiency. "Emergency extraction, code black, immediate evac required." The human watched her teammates panic with a sort of detached fascination usually reserved for observing exotic chemical reactions. Their evolutionary history had clearly not prepared them for this particular flavor of existential dread. Her own species, on the other hand, had spent millennia being hunted by everything from saber-toothed cats to their own inability to leave well enough alone. "The transport's responding," the Kith announced, his voice pitched somewhere between relief and hysteria. "ETA, 12 minutes." 12 minutes. The human looked at her scanner, then at the approaching heat signatures, then at her teammates who were already beginning to edge toward the landing zone with the sort of casual urgency that suggested they'd rather be literally anywhere else in the galaxy. "Go," she said simply. "What?" Cautious skin flickered through colors that didn't exist in most species' emotional spectrum. "Go, get to the transport. I'll finish the survey and meet you back at the ship." The three aliens stared at her with the sort of horrified fascination usually reserved for watching someone volunteer to juggle live plasma grenades. The Vrex's four arms gestured helplessly at the surrounding wasteland, where the crystalline stalkers were now close enough that their hunting calls echoed off the mineral formations like a deadly symphony. "You can't be serious," the cat squeaked. "That's suicide with extra steps." Human shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both complete confidence and casual disregard for the laws of probability. "I've got work to do. Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words, as it turned out. The transport arrived with the sort of desperate haste that suggested the pilot had no intention of lingering, and the three alien team members scrambled aboard with the ungainly desperation of beings who had suddenly remembered they valued their lives more than their hazard pay. As the transport lifted off, leaving a cloud of crystalline dust and the human standing alone in the middle of what was arguably the most dangerous real estate in the galaxy, the Vrex leaned toward the pilot and said, "We should probably file a report about this." The pilot, a grizzled veteran of a dozen extraction missions, glanced at the lone figure disappearing into the distance and activated the recording system. "Human survey team member abandoned in hostile territory due to equipment malfunction and imminent predator contact. Presumed deceased. Time of abandonment." He checked his chronometer. 14:37 local time. Below them, the human watched the transport disappear into the binary sunset and turned back to her scanner. The crystalline stalkers were close now, close enough that she could see the light refracting through their translucent bodies like deadly prisms. Their hunting calls had shifted from the distant echoes of pursuit to the closer, more personal sounds of creatures who had cornered their prey. She adjusted her atmospheric processor, checked her sample containers one more time, and walked toward the nearest mineral deposit with the sort of determined stride that had carried her species from the caves of Africa to the stars themselves. The stalkers watched her approach with the sort of predatory interest that suggested they were reassessing their hunting strategy. This prey wasn't running. It wasn't hiding. It was walking directly toward them with the casual confidence of something that had either given up entirely or had a plan that they hadn't considered. As the first crystalline form emerged from behind a rock formation, the human looked up from her scanner and said, "Well, hello there. I don't suppose you'd be interested in helping me find some high-grade mineral deposits?" The stalker tilted its head, a gesture that was probably meant to be intimidating, but instead came across as vaguely curious. Its packmates began to emerge from their hiding places, forming a loose circle around the human with a sort of tactical precision that suggested they'd done this before. Night was falling, and the binary suns were painting the crystal plains in shades of amber and crimson. The human stood in the center of the circle, surrounded by creatures that had evolved specifically to kill things like her, and did the most human thing possible. She got back to work. The crystalline stalkers had clearly attended the same predator finishing school as their evolutionary cousins across the galaxy, because they maintained their hunting circle with the sort of professional patience that suggested they'd done this dance before. Their bodies caught and refracted the dying light of the binary suns, creating a kaleidoscope of amber and crimson that would have been beautiful if it weren't attached to creatures specifically designed to turn organic matter into component molecules. The human continued her mineral survey with the sort of methodical determination that had once convinced her ancestors that walking upright across African savannas full of things with bigger teeth was a reasonable life choice. Her scanner beeped cheerfully as it detected high-grade crystalline deposits, blissfully unaware that its operator was currently surrounded by the local equivalent of a nightmare convention. The largest stalker, presumably the alpha since it was the only one sporting what appeared to be battle scars and an attitude problem, took a step closer. Its crystalline carapace made a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane, a musical note that somehow managed to convey both beauty and imminent disembowelment. "Nice try," the human said without looking up from her scanner, "but I've heard scarier sounds from my coffee maker on Monday mornings." The alpha tilted its head again, this time with what might have been confusion. In its considerable experience, prey animals typically responded to the approach of certain death with screaming, running, or the sort of creative begging that made the hunt more interesting. They did not, as a general rule, make casual observations about breakfast beverages. The human finally looked up from her scanner and made direct eye contact with the alpha. This was either the bravest or stupidest thing she could have done, depending on your perspective, on the relative value of courage versus self-preservation. The alpha's multifaceted eyes reflected her image back at her dozens of times, creating a disco ball effect that was both hypnotic and deeply unsettling. "Look," she said, addressing the alpha with a sort of reasonable tone usually reserved for difficult customers. "I get it. You're the apex predator, this is your territory, and I'm technically trespassing. But I've got a job to do, and honestly, I'm having a really bad day already." The alpha's packmates exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey confusion despite their complete lack of facial expressions. Their hunting protocols hadn't prepared them for prey that engaged in conversation, particularly prey that seemed to be treating their presence as more of an inconvenience than a death sentence. The human knelt down and began collecting mineral samples, her movements careful but not fearful. The stalkers watched with the sort of fascination usually reserved for observing exotic alien behavior, which, from their perspective, was exactly what they were doing. "See, the thing is," she continued, sealing a sample container with practiced efficiency, "my teammates just abandoned me here because they assumed you'd kill me, which, fair enough, is probably what you were planning to do. But here's the thing about humans. We're really, really good at not dying when we're supposed to." The alpha took another step closer, close enough that the human could see the intricate patterns etched into its crystalline surface. They weren't random. They were deliberate, almost artistic. The realization hit her like a plasma bolt to the cognitive centers. "You're not just predators," she said, her voice shifting from conversational to genuinely interested. "You're intelligent. Those patterns on your carapace, they're not natural formation. They're, what, territorial markers? Pack identification? Art?" The alpha's head tilted in what might have been acknowledgement, or it might have been the prelude to removing her head from her shoulders. With crystalline stalkers, the distinction was often academic. The human stood slowly, her scanner still in hand, and did something that would have caused her abandoned teammates to require immediate medical attention. She extended her hand toward the alpha, palm up, in the universal gesture of non-aggressive contact. "I'm not here to hunt you," she said quietly. "I'm here to dig up rocks and analyze mineral compositions. Boring stuff, really. But if you're intelligent, then maybe we can work something out." The alpha stared at her outstretched hand for a moment that stretched like taffy in a gravity well. Then, with a movement that was somehow both graceful and lethal, it extended one of its crystalline appendages and gently touched her palm. The contact was electric, literally. The alpha's natural bioelectric field sent a mild shock through the human's nervous system, but instead of jerking away, she held still. The sensation was strange, almost like touching a live wire made of glass and starlight. She said, studying the interaction with scientific fascination. "Bioelectric communication? You're not just touching me, you're sampling me, reading my electrical patterns." The alpha's touch became more deliberate, and suddenly the human was flooded with impressions that weren't quite thoughts, but weren't quite emotions either. Images of the crystal planes, the feeling of pack unity, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, and underneath it all, something that felt almost like curiosity. "You're wondering about me," she realized. "You've never encountered anything like humans before. We're not running, we're not hiding, and we're definitely not behaving like proper prey animals." The alpha withdrew its appendage and stepped back, but not in retreat. It was reassessing, recalibrating its entire approach to the situation. The pack maintained their circle, but their posture had shifted from hunting formation to something that looked more like cautious observation. The human looked around at the assembled stalkers and made a decision that would have horrified xenobiologists across the galaxy. She sat down on a convenient rock formation and continued her work, treating the pack of apex predators like particularly interesting background scenery. You know what I think, she said, running her scanner over another mineral sample. I think you're not just hunters. I think you're survivors. And surviving on a planet like this requires more than just sharp claws and an attitude problem. It requires intelligence, cooperation, and the ability to adapt to new situations. The Alpha made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a question. Its pack mates began to move closer, their previous hunting formation dissolving into something more like a curious gathering. The thing about humans, the human continued, sealing another sample container, is that we're really, really good at making friends with things that are supposed to kill us. It's kind of our specialty. We've domesticated everything from wolves to our own mortality, and we've got a track record of turning natural enemies into allies. She looked up at the Alpha, who was now close enough that she could see her own reflection in its multifaceted eyes. So, here's my proposal. You help me finish my survey, and I'll help you with whatever it is you need help with. Because trust me, after today, I've got nowhere else to go. The Alpha considered this proposal with the sort of careful deliberation that suggested it was weighing options it had never considered before. Its pack mates watched the interaction with the sort of attention usually reserved for learning new hunting techniques. As the binary suns finally disappeared below the horizon, plunging the crystal plains into the sort of darkness that made shadows unnecessary, the Alpha made its decision. It settled onto the ground next to the human, its crystalline body creating a windbreak against the planet's harsh night atmosphere. The rest of the pack followed suit, forming a loose circle around the human that was no longer a hunting formation, but something closer to a protective perimeter. The human continued her work by the light of her scanner, occasionally glancing at her unexpected companions with the sort of satisfied expression that suggested she'd just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Well," she said to the Alpha, who was watching her work with what might have been professional interest, "this is going to be an interesting night." The Alpha's response was a sound that could have been agreement, or possibly the crystalline equivalent of laughter. Either way, it was the beginning of something that would make the xenobiologist databases very, very confused. As the night deepened and the crystal plains came alive with the sounds of nocturnal hunters, the human worked by the light of her scanner, while surrounded by creatures that had evolved specifically to kill things like her. It was, she reflected, probably the safest she'd felt since arriving on Kepler 442b. After all, nothing else on the planet was going to mess with something that had made friends with the apex predators. 3 weeks into what the Galactic Mining Consortium's incident report would eventually classify as presumed deceased due to hostile wildlife interaction, the human had managed to accomplish something that would have impressed xenobiologists if any of them had been foolish enough to stick around to observe it. She had turned certain death into a thriving partnership with creatures that officially didn't exist on any intelligence scale. The Alpha Stalker, who had earned the informal designation of Big Shiny for reasons that were both obvious and practical, had proven to be remarkably adept at locating mineral deposits. Its pack's natural ability to navigate the crystalline terrain meant they could identify geological formations that her scanner might have missed, while her technological analysis provided them with information about their territory that they'd never had access to before. It was, the human reflected while calibrating her equipment for the morning survey, the sort of mutually beneficial arrangement that her species had been perfecting since the first cave dweller figured out that sharing food with wolves was preferable to being eaten by them. "Morning, Big Shiny," she said to the Alpha, who was perched on a nearby crystal formation in what had become their established routine. "Ready to go find some more of those rare earth deposits?" Big Shiny's response was a complex harmonic that had taken her 2 weeks to interpret as enthusiasm mixed with what might have been the crystalline equivalent of professional satisfaction. The pack had developed their own relationship with the human's work, treating her mineral surveys like a sophisticated form of territory mapping that helped them understand their domain in ways they'd never considered. The human had, in turn, learnt to read the pack's bioelectric communications well enough to understand basic concepts like danger nearby, good hunting area, and the weird bipedal thing is doing something interesting again. It wasn't exactly conversation, but it was functional communication between species that had evolved on different worlds with completely different survival strategies. "Right then," she said, shouldering her equipment pack while the rest of the pack arranged themselves into what had become their standard formation. "Let's go see what today's geological survey can teach us about crystalline formation patterns and optimal hunting territories." The irony wasn't lost on her that she was probably the only human in the galaxy who could deliver a technical briefing to a pack of apex predators and receive what appeared to be genuine interest in response. Big Shiny's pack had proven to be remarkably intelligent, with individual members showing specialization in different aspects of their collaborative hunting strategy. There was the Scout, a smaller, faster stalker whose crystalline structure was optimized for speed and stealth. The Tracker, whose sensory apparatus could detect prey signatures across vast distances. The Strategist, who seemed to coordinate pack movements with a sort of tactical precision that would have impressed military analysts. And the Enforcer, whose battle-scarred carapace suggested it had earned its position through the sort of direct negotiation that left permanent impressions. The human had assigned them nicknames that reflected their roles, rather than attempting to understand their actual designation systems. Partly because crystalline stalker social hierarchies were apparently based on harmonic frequencies that human ears couldn't properly distinguish, and partly because she'd discovered that talking to them helped her think through problems more clearly. "Speedy's found something interesting about 3 kilometers northwest," she announced, interpreting the Scout's recent bioelectric report. "High mineral concentration with unusual crystalline matrix formations could be exactly what we're looking for." The pack moved with the sort of coordinated efficiency that came from millions of years of evolutionary refinement, while the human kept pace with a sort of determined persistence that came from a species that had decided walking everywhere was a perfectly reasonable approach to galactic exploration. As they approached the site Speedy had identified, the human scanner began registering readings that made her pause and recalibrate her equipment. The mineral deposits weren't just high grade, they were showing quantum signatures that suggested something far more valuable than standard crystalline matrices. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered, studying the readings with the sort of professional excitement that most people reserved for discovering they'd won the lottery. "These aren't just rare Earth deposits. These are quantum-stable crystalline formations with enough coherence to support advanced computational matrices." Big Shiny tilted its head in what she'd learned to recognize as a request for clarification. The pack had become genuinely interested in her work, not just as a means of territorial mapping, but as a way of understanding their environment in ways their natural senses couldn't provide. "It means," she explained, kneeling down to collect samples while the pack formed a protective perimeter around her, "that your territory is sitting on top of one of the most valuable mineral deposits in the galaxy, the kind of thing that could power quantum computers or support faster-than-light communication networks." The implications were staggering. The Galactic Mining Consortium had sent survey teams to catalog standard mineral deposits, but what they'd actually found was something that could revolutionize interstellar technology, the sort of discovery that would bring mining operations, scientific expeditions, and corporate interests flooding to Kepler 442b in numbers that would make the current survey mission look like a casual hiking expedition. The human looked up from her scanner at the pack of crystalline stalkers who were watching her work with what appeared to be professional interest, and realized that she'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple survival situation. "You know what this means, don't you?" she said to Big Shiny, who was close enough that she could see her reflection multiplied in its multifaceted eyes. "When the consortium finds out about this, they're going to come back. In force. With mining equipment, security teams, and probably enough firepower to level half the continent." The pack's response was a complex harmonic that conveyed understanding mixed with what might have been grim amusement. They'd dealt with alien incursions before, apparently, and their track record suggested they'd been notably successful at discouraging unwanted visitors. "The thing is," the human continued, sealing her sample containers with the sort of careful precision that suggested she was thinking several moves ahead, "they're not going to ask permission. They're going to classify this as a hostile environment, authorize whatever force they think is necessary to secure the area, and turn your territory into an industrial mining operation." Big Shiny's harmonic response was considerably less amused and significantly more pointed. The pack's formation shifted subtly, their relaxed perimeter becoming something more like a tactical assessment of potential threats. "But," the human said, standing and looking round at the assembled stalkers with a sort of expression that suggested she was formulating a plan that would probably horrify her former teammates, "what if they had to negotiate with someone who already has territorial rights? Someone who's proven capable of not just surviving in predator territory, but thriving in it?" The Alpha Stalker made a sound that was somewhere between a question and a statement. its bioelectric field flickering with what might have been curiosity, or possibly the crystalline equivalent of entrepreneurial interest. "I'm saying," the human explained, adjusting her equipment pack and looking around at the crystal formations that glittered in the binary sunlight, "that I'm not just a survey team member anymore. I'm a resident. And residents have rights that abandoned personnel don't." She gestured toward the pack, who were watching this development with the sort of attention usually reserved for learning new hunting techniques. "And I'm not just any resident. I'm a resident with the sort of local connections that could make mining operations very, very difficult for anyone who doesn't play by the rules." Big Shiny's response was a complex harmonic that conveyed understanding, amusement, and what might have been approval of the human strategic thinking. The pack had apparently decided that their unusual alliance was proving more interesting than their traditional approach to territorial management. "So here's what we're going to do," the human said, shouldering her equipment and looking around at the crystalline formations that represented both incredible wealth and potential catastrophe. "We're going to finish mapping this territory, catalogue every deposit worth mining, and establish the sort of comprehensive territorial survey that would make corporate lawyers weep with frustration." She turned to address the pack directly, her voice carrying the sort of authoritative tone that suggested she'd moved from survival mode to strategic planning. "And when they come back, and they will come back, they're going to find that Kepler 4142b already has a functioning territorial management system, one that doesn't take kindly to uninvited guests." The pack's harmonic response was a complex symphony that conveyed approval, anticipation, and what might have been the crystalline equivalent of predatory satisfaction. They'd found something better than prey. They'd found a partner who understood both the value of their territory and the importance of protecting it. As the human resumed her survey work, surrounded by creatures that had evolved specifically to kill things like her, she reflected on how her situation had evolved from abandoned victim to territorial coordinator. It was, she decided, probably the most human thing that had ever happened on Kepler 442b. After all, her species had turned every disadvantage into an advantage, every threat into an opportunity, and every impossible situation into a chance to prove that impossible was just another word for hasn't been tried by humans yet. The crystalline stalkers had chosen their ally well. 6 months later, the Galactic Mining Consortium's follow-up expedition arrived, expecting to find bones and file the appropriate posthumous paperwork. Instead, they discovered a thriving research station surrounded by crystalline formations that had been carved into what appeared to be decorative patterns. The human emerged from her shelter, flanked by Big Shiny and the pack, all of whom had developed an impressive collection of what looked suspiciously like territorial markings. The corporate expedition's leader, a particularly nervous Zephyrian, approached, with a sort of cautious optimism usually reserved for defusing plasma bombs. "We're here to begin full-scale mining operations," he announced, waving official documentation that seemed significantly less impressive when delivered to someone backed by apex predators. The human examined the paperwork with professional interest while her crystalline companions arranged themselves in what corporate security would later describe as aggressively protective formations. "Interesting," she said, handing back the documents. "But you'll need to file territorial usage permits with the local management authority first, which would be..." She gestured toward Big Shiny, whose harmonic response roughly translated to payment required for mining rights. The corporate expedition suddenly realized they'd created their own worst nightmare, a human who'd learned to negotiate from a position of strength, with backup that could slice through starship hulls. Bureaucracy, it turned out, was far more terrifying than any apex predator. A solitary